Hi. So I'd like to call the Policy Committee meeting to order. It is Tuesday, May 25th, 2021, 6:02 p.m. My name is Roberto Rodriguez. I'm chair of the committee. We'll start with a quick introduction, just your name, title, and pass it on to the next person so that we cover everyone that's present. So I'll pass it on to Mr. Irish.
Jeff Irish, represent District 5, and I'll pass it on to Aura.
Hello, I'm Aura Russell Better, and I'm the District 4 school board member. And I will pass to Emily. Ms. Chung.
Hi everyone, my name is Emily Chung, and I'm the Deering High School student representative. I'll pass it to Mr. Giesman.
Thanks. My name is Jake Giesman. I'm the interim principal for Remote Academy. I'll pass it to Anne.
Hi everyone, I'm Anne. I'm the executive assistant to the superintendent and district office manager, and I'm also the policy committee secretary. I'll pass it off to Aaron.
Good evening. Aaron Townsend, assistant superintendent of school management. And Javier.
Javier Botana, superintendent, and I will pass it on to Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you, Mr. Botana. Abdullahi Ahmed, co-principal at Deering High School.
And last but not least, we were joined by Ms. Figdor.
Hello, I'm Emily Figdor, the District 2 rep and school board chair, and my apologies for being a couple minutes late.
You were just in time, actually. Thank you for joining us. Great. So quickly, I'll go through the agenda, which is actually really simple, pretty condensed. We're going to approve our minutes from the last meeting. Then the bulk of our time we'll spend doing the law enforcement policy discussion. We had a really engaging and deep discussion last week, our quadrant discussion. So I'm looking forward to seeing where we advance today's work. And then after that, we'll be adjourning. So like I said, the law enforcement policies will take up the bulk of our time. So moving to the approval of the minutes, is there a motion to approve the minutes of April 28, 2021? Mr. Irish, second by Ms. Russell Better. Any questions in the minutes? Seeing none, there's no one listed on the attendees. So for public comment, we'll skip it. And if there's any further discussion, seeing none, all those in favor of approving the minutes of April 28, 2021, please indicate, and we can just raise our hands. And that's unanimous with Ms. Chung voting with the members of the committee. All right, and then superintendent or assistant super. Actually, before we move on, since we last met as a committee, the board approved the recommended revisions to the policy, to the discipline policies. So just wanted to, once again, just as a committee, just thank you all for the part that we played in advancing it, acknowledging that it had been a process that started long before any of us were in our current roles. But again, just wanted to note that so that ends up in these meeting's minutes. All right, so now I'll pass it on to Assistant Superintendent Aaron Townsend for today's law enforcement policy discussion. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, we're excited to continue to go deeper based on last month's conversation around, how we want to, what kind of lenses, I think, was the language we were using in bringing forward some revisions to these policies. So how I'm imagining we'll kind of do some work today is just revisit that for a brief moment, right? So that it can be kind of fresh in folks' minds in terms of some of those lenses and how we are thinking about that. And then, as we agreed at the last meeting, staff would, kind of in between meetings, step back and look at the list of policies that involve law enforcement and bring forward some potential proposed revisions and articulate some rationale as it related to those lenses. So I think what you'll see as we work through that, so I think I have a little slide deck that'll help hopefully to kind of anchor us with that. It may, I think I'll probably flash the language, the little carve outs of the language that refer to law enforcement in some of the policies, just so that as we talk about them, we can see specifically what that language is. So again, we don't have we're not bringing forward red line proposed revisions. We wanted, based off last month's conversation, kind of talk a little bit conceptually about where we think the changes land. And I'll steal my own thunder because this isn't, a dramatic production. It also leads us to a recommendation about the development of, and this will be, I think, where we may spend the bulk of our conversation, to the adoption of a new policy, so KLG, which is the policy that kind of never really existed that should have. It was referred to in other places in our policy book, but never actually existed. It's not quite the policy, but a very related one that should have been in place that would have helped to anchor the SRO MOU. But we've come around and we can talk a little bit about how we potentially see the role of that and so forth. So, but I think it makes sense to hit on some of the existing policies and what we've learned, kind of between the last couple meetings about those and implications we think in terms of proposed revisions. So our hope today is to kind of get some conceptual alignment around those revisions so that we can do the actual, red line drafting of, policy language to some of those policies. And then as it relates to KLG, potentially be in a position to bring forward a first draft of that policy for discussion. So hopefully that'll work for us tonight in terms of process. I think as we'll get to that, I think it'll bring us back to some questions about both engagement and timeline, as we think a bit more about, the development of that kind of overarching policy, KLG, about relationship to law enforcement that doesn't currently exist for us, right? Everything's kind of spelled out in little bits and pieces across all sorts of different policies. So that's a little bit of just kind of introduction and, kind of preview of how I'm thinking about us working through this agenda item tonight. Are there any clarifying questions, anything before we get started?
I have just one, just to clarify. So are you proposing that we move forward in the direction that KLG is what we're going to focus on, or is that just kind of like an option that we're going to consider?
Well, I think we'll get to that part of the discussion. I think that should be what I have laid out, in the slide deck that's in board docs, and I'm going to kind of step us through it, is looking at the existing policies that we've had that have references to law enforcement. Some of them we've already, so I think we should work through those briefly. I think that naturally, as we did that work, it led us to a place of, well, we need this KLG. Right, policy. And so, I think we're bringing that forward as a recommendation of establishing that. I think by working through the policies, we'll see that, and we'll have some conversation about what we think the content of that KLG policy should be. There are some pieces kind of prescribed a little bit by law that should be there and by some of our proposed revisions to the other policies. But I think as well, that's going to be a space for us to articulate more broadly, how we envision the relationship. And there's some draft model policies, both from Drummond as well from the state of Washington. So we have some tools to work from, move from, to draft that policy.
Okay. But let's see. Yeah, let's work through it. The only point that I'm hesitating with, and in clarifying how KLG is going to be used today, maybe I didn't get to it, but KLG, the intent of KLG is to like you said, to have like an overarching description of our relationship with law enforcement. By having a KLG type of policy, we are already asserting certain things about an established relationship. Right. Versus the way that we've been working with the policies situationally, particularly the way that we did the quadrant exercise last week. We acknowledge the rationale of situational policies. Even as we were discussing the situations, the superintendent mentioned that it was a fruitful discussion because it gave guidance to what you guys were going to recommend.
Yep.
So that's fine. So I don't know if that helps, but that I just wanted to explain my point of hesitance. But let's work through them today.
Yeah. I think it'll become clear as we work through it of kind of like what the need is for that. Again, we're not in a position of proposing to like approve or do anything today, but I think let's look at those existing set of policies and kind of what we think the implications based off last month's conversation are. And then we'll have some space to kind of talk about what we think the role of potentially this KLG policy would be. All right. I'm a little fearful. It may be a fair amount of sharing screen, so apologize for that. But and I do want to kind of toggle back and forth between the slide deck and some of the policy language just to make it easier and for everybody in terms of participation. So I'm not going to go full on present mode, but so just the first reminder. Come on. No, I'm not moving. All right. I apologize. I don't know why am I. So while this is loading and trying to get us to the first slide, sorry, I don't know why it's sticky here, but, just the reminder, and again, the artifact that we looked at and were discussing last time is in the agenda or in the board docs, that we had the 4-quadrant where we're looking at, what is the benefit, to an individual and what is the potential for harm to the individual. That was along one axis that we were considering. And then a similar kind of framing of what's the potential benefit for the community and what's the potential harm for the community in terms of engaging law enforcement. So I say that to just kind of bring that back into our minds, right, of kind of using that paradigm. What I'm trying to get to, and I don't know what's going on with my computer here.
I would say you have too many tabs open, but we've seen Grace Valenzuela's computer handle way more than this.
They're not around the edge.
Aaron, I've got it up if you want me to present.
Okay, yeah, I guess so. I don't know. Sorry about that. I'm going to just make sure everybody can share. Yeah, Jake, if you don't mind, let's try that. Apologize. What the deal is there?
Can you see it?
Yes. So these were a number of the kind of questions that emerged as we talked through those different scenarios and situations that we thought were, I think ended up describing them as kind of lenses to apply to our thinking around, proposed revisions to the policy. So one, we, said first, is it something we even have discretion around, right? Is it legally required? So we did a pass through, engaged with, our partners at Drummond Woodsum to look at the suite of policies that, kind of reference law enforcement to get their, their opinion about which ones, where we have discretion, where we don't. So we'll share that as we move through the policies. But a few of the other ones were like, does this need to happen at school? Is our engagement of law enforcement preemptive or reactionary? We were having conversations about dances and, calling that, on one end, that being preemptive, and that also kind of just having evolved, is that the way it's always been done, or reactionary once an incident has happened? Are we creating the potential trauma or the potential for trauma for individuals, by engaging law enforcement? And I think the converse of that is the quadrants also was, is there the potential for benefit for an individual or the community? And then, is the engagement for the individual voluntary or compelled, in terms of engaging with law enforcement? And then the last one, are there just traditional ways that we've been in relationship that, don't necessarily have a strong rationale, and it is just because the way we have been interacting with them, and that's quote unquote the way it's always been done. So in trying to interrogate for those kinds of places. So those were the lenses that we discussed last time to kind of bring forward to these policies. And so the first few, so Jake, if you want to move to the next slide. So, one of the first thing I want to acknowledge is 3 of the policies that referenced law enforcement, we have already proposed, drafted, and the board has adopted revisions around. So, for example, the JIC, the Student Code of Conduct, there were no legal requirements for law enforcement references related to that policy. This, in the prior version before our revisions, this had kind of the ghost reference to policy KLG that never actually existed. So we eliminated those references. Obviously, we've already adopted this policy, and these the things are addressed in the other specific policies that we'll work through. So we have kind of already addressed the language that referenced law enforcement and JIC through our work in the discipline around the discipline policies. So JICK. So JICK was one of the policies, the bullying policy, where Maine law does require school units to have a procedure for communicating with law enforcement if we believe it'll as a criminal act or violation. So in our review and adoption of that policy, that was the only language that referenced law enforcement there. And we, maintained that language in the revisions that we adopted, in part, again, because we knew from the Drummond feedback and the discipline policy work, that was a required portion. So again, I would say in the context of that policy, we have kind of vetted, it is legally required, and we've already adopted the revisions to that policy, which includes the legal requirements. So let's go to the last one, and then we can pause about these 3, because these ones, I think we've kind of like saying, okay, we've already addressed these 3. So JICIA, the weapons, violence, and school safety. Again, if you'll recall, we had discussion about this when we were reviewing this policy as part of the discipline policy work. As we noted at the time and subsequently, left in the revision, the Federal Gun-Free Schools Act requires referral of firearms violations to law enforcement. So that language, again, maintained in the revisions. That was the only referral to law or language referring to law enforcement within the context of that policy. So that remains in place, kind of meeting the legal requirements. So 3 of kind of that list of policies that referenced law enforcement, we've already either made changes or, vetted the legal requirements and continued the language as required for all 3 of those policies. So, in a sense, I would say, okay, we've kind of addressed those. Now we can move on to the other ones that we haven't tackled yet, and we can work. That's what we'll work through. There's 4 of them I'd like to talk a little bit about today before we get to this question about KLG. But let me pause for a second, see if there's any questions about these 3 that we've already kind of done work on through the discipline policy work.
And because we're sharing the screen, if anyone has a question, use the raise your hand feature, please. I'm okay. So I'm fine, leaving these with the revisions that were made as part of the discipline policies. I guess once we go through the policies that we've not yet gone through, I'm just wondering what how we're using those different points that in the previous slide, the different reference, whether we're legally
lenses. Yeah.
So I just wonder how the policies that we did revise, how we would look at them through these questions as well, just for the sake of the thought process. But let's work on the ones that we haven't yet looked at.
Well, I'll say briefly, at least for the last two, it was kind of like the first one. It was that first lens. Is it legally required? And the answer was yes. And that was kind of the language. So those were places where we didn't have, discretion per se in terms of the language that we would include there. So that was, so that was kind of the application of those lenses to those two. I think we proposed revisions to JIC, the Student Code of Conduct. Looking at it, I would say through a different lens at that time in terms of the feedback on that policy and how to make that useful for students and families, because the original draft was just referenced all of our other policies related to discipline and didn't really have much in terms of substance around kind of a vision of Student Code of Conduct. And so that's what, those are the revisions we made, not necessarily through these lenses, but thinking about it through the equity review of the discipline policies to kind of make it more accessible and coherent for students and families. Why don't we go on and try the work through one of these next ones that we haven't tackled. Okay. So one of the ones that has a reference to, a minor reference to, to the, let's see, caught up to law enforcement is JICH, or Student Drug and Alcohol Use Policy, as well as the related procedure. So, but the language is relatively similar that flows from the policy into the procedure. And just, so it's shared, the highlighted language, and again, these policies are in board docs, that refers to law enforcement says the school resource officer or other appropriate law enforcement authority shall also be notified of violations of this policy. So just briefly, and I'll invite the superintendent, Dr. Ahmed, or Mr. Giesman to weigh in as well, with some of how our thinking, because it was a collective, the four of us met to kind of talk through with these lenses, just any of your reflections about these proposed revisions. But one, there are no legal requirements related to this policy in terms of referrals to law enforcement. So this is one where we do, so answering that first question of a lens, this is a place where we as a school board have some discretion about the language we would use and whether we would include it. So based, I'll say just specifically what we're proposing, and then I can open it up for reflections from our staff team about the why and the lenses. But one is, we are proposing to change the language from shall refer, like thus the requirement, to may refer. To leave that option open. I think, for me, there's some reflection there. If the shall refer, has that potential in terms of negative impact for an individual, because the policy speaks to all manner of both substances, as well as it does not differentiate, in that shall refer from a simple instance of possession, the example we were using, possession of one joint versus possession of significant quantities that would imply distribution and trafficking. So there was no nuance to that shall. It was all a direct referral. And so I think in terms of the potential negative impacts that we're aware of and so forth, it felt like it was appropriate to have more discretion. We wanted to have, has been consistent with some of our review here, that any referral would be in consultation with the superintendent or designee, so that there was some kind of check and monitoring on that, to establish consistency across school sites. And then to be able to provide a little more guidance about when it may be appropriate, when, there were potentially multiple instances of use, and we had tried other means of addressing it from a kind of therapeutic approach. That was part of our discussion last time. And, there was still presenting challenges, or if it was something larger scale and there were, potential trafficking issues in play, felt like we would want to be able to reserve the right, for issues that were that, kind of egregious, to potentially engage law enforcement. And then we felt like there needed to be guidance in that, policy if we weren't turning it over to provide guidance to school administrators about how to get rid of and destroy any kind of confiscated substances or prohibited substances so that they weren't liable for that. So that's not necessarily in relationship to the lenses, the various lenses, but providing some guidance and protection for our school administrators. Anybody else want to weigh in, Superintendent or Dr. Ahmed or Mr. Dr. Giesman?
I guess just a question. I'm trying to, as we do this, make sure that people have the actual language in front of them. So are you all are able to see the language in policy JICH? I think it's important to be able to reference the actual document, which is the only place where the reference appears. And so I guess the only thing I would add to what Aaron just said is that obviously in the existing policy, it says the school resource officer or other appropriate, and obviously in our context, it would not be the school resource officer. So it would, that would disappear along with the shall being revised to be a, may with consultation with the superintendent. Jake, it might be better if you just scroll down. Is that you there, or is that, yeah, scroll down and go to the actual link underneath. Yeah, because there it's highlighted. It's in page 2. Oh, I guess it's not highlighted. It's highlighted in mine for some reason. Yeah, that's the.
Aaron, you're muted.
The attachments to this agenda item in board docs have the highlighted references.
Got it.
So I have a couple of hands raised. Ms. Rosa Better.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a question, Aaron, about the language where it said in consultation with the superintendent or designee. Was that the language? Mm-hmm. Is that just so that if you say the superintendent wasn't, is that just to have like an alternative person, like just that the language says it could be someone else besides the superintendent, or is that because there potentially is a different role that someone may? I'm just trying to clarify why it has that language.
Specifically the designee reference.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's used relatively consistently throughout. I mean, that could be a place where it would be more appropriate to be a bit more explicit. So that, because I think in some cases the designee can be, in some cases the designee may be the school administrator. I think in this case we were imagining that there was a level of review, beyond the school site in terms of law enforcement referrals. So, it could say in terms of, in consultation with superintendent or, I don't know if we would say, assistant superintendent. I think there's one I was pausing because there was some other example, I think recently, potentially in the discipline policies where, we had a similar conversation about defining the designee a little bit more explicitly. So, but we can look back and find that language.
Okay, yeah. I think it was for my own clarification, but then as you say that, I guess I would just support anything more explicit. I mean, part of it was just for me to understand if it was only in the absence of the superintendent being able to be available. I didn't know if that's what it meant versus that there was a different chain of how it would go, but I guess that just illustrates that maybe more detail would be useful. So, thank you.
Yeah, and the term superintendent designee comes actually in other areas as well, like in special education when we are building administrators are committing resources. It is like the superintendent designee. So we act in the building as well, superintendent designee. So it comes in many areas.
Let's go, Ms. Chung, and then to Chair Figdor for a couple of questions.
I just had a quick question about in the cases where if we do decide to refer a student case to law enforcement when it comes to this policy, are there certain procedures that we'll put in place or that have already been put in place for how the law enforcement would contribute to the case or how they would support it or help to solve the issue? Or is that something that will depend case by case?
Well, I think generally I would say that's a great question, Emily, as usual, that we would move forward, kind of essentially in many respects, the police are going to conduct if a case is referred to them, they will pursue and conduct their own independent investigation, and that matter will, be addressed through, whatever, kind of criminal prosecution may end up happening and so that is thus at that point out of the jurisdiction of, PPS. We on our own behalf would pursue our own kind of parallel investigation to make any determinations around, school discipline that would be, or supports that would be appropriate. So they kind of operate a little bit in parallel. If that referral to law enforcement, it's because we believe, and maybe that could be, some language there, that there's the potential for that level of, concern of a criminal issue that would then initiate that process. But that's where I think part of why we want to back away from the shall for every instance and have more discretion about in which situations that's, we would initiate that because of the, potential ramifications.
So once we pass it on or we refer it, we are working in parallel, but not able to really work cohesively because it's just separate.
There is, we'll get to some language about sharing of information and so forth down in terms of some of the other policies, but essentially, yes, they kind of operate in parallel a little bit.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Let's go to Mr. Irish, just to acknowledge him as a member of the committee, and then we'll go to Chair Victor after that. Excuse me.
Thank you. And Emily, I apologize for jumping in line there. I'm always a little bit hesitant when we select the word may, because I think it opens a lot of doors. I do like the as we're contemplating drafting this policy, in providing examples of when it may be appropriate to refer to law enforcement. One of the things that I see in the top bullet point is we have no legal requirements related to this policy. And when we remove the word shall, and this may be a question for council or maybe superintendent's already consulted, but and we insert the word may, if we're talking about discipline or referral for whoever violated the drug and alcohol use policy, if there's a negative impact, well, let's just say a student provided another student a substance, whereby that student was somehow harmed in that when we use the word may, and perhaps we've not made the decision to refer it to law enforcement, do we suffer, or do we put ourselves in a position where we may be negatively impacted legally? And that may be the case for both of them, but if we use the word shall, does that shelter us a little bit from a legal premise? And I know that's a little bit deeper and down the road a little bit in the drafting process, but when I see the word shall and may, that just kind of brings it to mind. So
I think generally it shall requires us to do it. And I think that the reason that we are shifting away from that is, and I think Aaron described it, when he was walking through, that, when it's a shall in this context, it means that any instance is something that needs to be reported, and it takes away all judgment and discretion, which is what we need to do as administrators, is to bring our judgment and thinking to these situations. And so that's, I think, the reason for shall. I mean, there is always a liability. There's a liability if we refer, and there's a liability if we don't refer. So I think that, that's where judgment, discretion, training, and, all of those things factor into how those decisions are made. I think, our adding the consultation with the superintendent or designee is, on the one hand to monitor, on the other hand to give it a, to sort of allow for a processing, a thinking through, sort of addressing that particular situation through more than one vantage point. So I think that that's the idea behind that. But, in terms of counsel, we did or we didn't. I don't know if we've had the policies go through yet, Aaron, or if we are.
We had the existing policies, that was where we got the judgment that there was no legal requirement. We have not had them, review. We were bringing it here first about the shift to may refer. I guess
from a legal perspective, the fact that there is no legal requirement for that referral, there won't be any different direction given by counsel. That isn't anything that I haven't said, which is, yes, there is a liability if you, have a situation that you made a decision not to make a referral and, something happened as a result of that. And, there's also the same situation in the reverse. If you actually make a referral and, something happens subsequently, and it turns out that you maybe shouldn't have made that referral. So I think that, that's the reality of the work that we do, is that every decision that we make has the possibility for, liability arising from it.
I would offer two quick things just before we close out, Mr. Irish, and go to Director Vidor. One, I think, from conversations around these kinds of things, the policy still expressly prohibits, right, the possession or distribution. So it's not like there's any committing of that, right? So I think that that's a layer that, of protection, if you will. And then the second is, even though the current, and I don't know if this is what Drummond will say, we'll obviously kind of go through that process, but, the language currently is shall, and again, Dr. Giesman and Dr. Ahmed, you can speak to this, but I feel very confident in saying we do not consistently follow our policy currently, because in part, because it is so broad ranging, it's included alcohol, to, such a wide range and can be of varying amounts. And so having a policy with a little bit more nuance and discretion, as the superintendent described, I think we have the ability to more consistently kind of apply, because currently building administrators and so forth are using their judgment, right? And that stands in contrast to the language of the policy. So I don't know that that's a huge liability issue ultimately, but it's always best case if we're following our own policies.
Thank you both.
Chair Figdor.
Yeah, thank you all for this work. I guess I have a couple of different thoughts in terms of feedback. Similar to Ms. Russell-Better, I would suggest that I think with the consultation, it's been a long day, with the superintendent or designee, I think the idea here is to have another set of another top leader in the district weighing in on the decision. So I think or designee might be too open-ended in this case. And so I'd like to further specify that that's an assistant principal, assistant superintendent, or the superintendent. Or if there are other people who should be, on that list, certainly open to that. But the idea is someone in addition to the building leader. And then I wonder if, Aaron, you used the word, what did you use the word egregious, something of that sort. And I wonder if that should go in here. Like we need right now, it feels very open-ended to me, where what I think we're going after is helping to define for our administrators what would constitute an appropriate referral. And so I think we would need, I understand the examples, but I still feel like that might be too open-ended if we used a word like, some adjective that got at the extent of the violation of the policy. So I would like to, work towards making this less based on an individual's judgment, because I think our judgment about violations of this policy could vary across very well-meaning, folks in the district. So I think I would like to see it become more specific.
Great. Okay. This is super helpful. Part of why it felt too, just too early to bring forward proposed language. And so this feedback's helpful that we can incorporate to bring back draft language.
Ms. Russell-Better?
Oh, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to clarify what Ms. Figdor was mentioning about the egregious part, like where in this language, and maybe you need to answer that, Emily.
Let's not try to do that
okay.
At this point. Let's just sort of walk through and try to have this principles-based discussion, and then we will work on language and bring it back. And
okay.
Time to look at that.
So let's move to the next policy. So I'll describe this, and then, Jake, maybe I can bring up and share the specific language here. So JRA, the Student Records Policy, and the related, it also has a related procedure, but there is no legal requirement to designate a law enforcement partner to disclose student records without parent consent. So that's kind of the essence of the law enforcement referral in this policy, is that we designate, currently Portland Police Department as our law enforcement partner, and thus that allows us under the student records and FERPA to be able to disclose records without parent consent. So we would propose to eliminate that section E, the designation of the law enforcement unit. Again, I'll bring that up in a moment. And address guidance related to sharing information with law enforcement in this new policy, KLG, relations with law enforcement authorities. So one, removing the formal designation around PPD as the law enforcement partner, in large part because of that, I think from the lenses discussion, the the knowledge of being able to facilitate and provide information about students without parent consent was one of the elements that, I think in the, from the language before in terms of potential risk for students and being mindful of that, that we had concerns about. That being said, we recognize there will need to be, kind of language in KLG about how we address, the sharing of information and what opportunities that is. So let me share just briefly what the language looks like in this policy so that we can be anchored in that, and then happy to have anybody else share. So this is within the overall student records policy. This is the language that is currently exists.
And we're proposing to just do away with that section. So basically, health and safety emergencies would become letter E.
So I think for purposes of now, because we want to get into a broader discussion about what we think KLG should really, be like, want to answer maybe some specific questions here as opposed to getting into a discussion at this point about what guidelines we should be kind of putting around sharing information. That's obviously a substantive discussion that we need to have as a group and kind of come to agreement around. But I think that'll be located more initially, conceptually today and kind of principles based, as the superintendent said, when in just a moment we get to KLG. But so that's what I'd propose, just any clarifications about our proposal here, not necessarily getting into the details about what guidelines we might be proposing around the sharing of information.
Yeah, that's helpful because you're right. Like there's something to discuss here, but if the question is, can this be omitted from this policy and then be addressed elsewhere? If that's the direction that we're heading into, I guess that's what gets us into KLG, which is ultimately the big discussion we need to have.
Yeah,
I'm okay with that. Yeah, I guess once we see what KLG, what you guys are thinking about it, then maybe we can reflect on this differently.
Great. Any other questions about this, the Education Records Act? Jake, do you want to take us to the next one? Sorry for the back and forth. So JIH is the policy about questioning and searches of students. So again, having vetted, there's no specific legal requirement for involving law enforcement in the questioning and search of students. So we're kind of applying the lenses, proposing revisions to be more explicit, I think a little bit, and, kind of related to prior discussions about referring guidance for firearm violations. So, that as we know from the other work, that's a required referral, when there's a firearm involved. And so getting explicit about that in the questioning or search of a student, if they found a firearm, that would require, in a referral to law enforcement. Again, and when this may come back to, how we want to get clear, but include language that forwarding evidence, and you'll see that comes from some of the existing language, is at the discretion of the superintendent. And then lastly, this is maybe somewhat minor, but wanted to add a cross-reference that doesn't exist right now to the bullying and cyberbullying policy, because certainly through an investigation process, that may emerge, and the implications around the language that we talked about earlier might, be relevant. So, but that's not currently cross-referenced as one of the policies. So we'd want that to be true. And so we would align any of these proposed revisions as well within the related procedure. So I'll share what the current language is so you can see how that language is currently situated. So it's policy. So the current referral is language referring to law enforcement is here highlighted in yellow. Anything else, Javier, Dr. Giesman, or Dr. Ahmed want to add in terms of our reflections on this one? And any questions or feedback from the committee?
Mr. Irish?
Can we go back to the previous slide?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm just trying to, I don't know, I have two screens, but I can't pull up two different things. So I'm trying to find out where the is there a substantive change?
Well, I think what we would be proposing is to add, and again, we'll bring back language and we can get into the specific of language, but we would be adding some language to be explicit that any firearms, right, would be appropriate to be, that were discovered in a search of a student would be referred to law enforcement. So that's one. So that's a substantive change, that there isn't that kind of explicit language as we saw. It's pretty, discretionary and vague in terms of the current language in the policy. So we would provide more explicit guidance about, related to the firearm piece. And then similar to, what we looked at in the, drug and alcohol use policy, that there would be some level of kind of thought partnership and consultation with, central office leadership in terms of any other potential evidence and whether it's appropriate to, refer that or forward it. And that was why we used that language. That was what with the existing language in the policy was.
Jeff, I think we just lost you.
Your audio, at least. Okay. We'll see if we can get Jeff back. Aaron, a quick question until we can get Jeff back. So it's how much of what the revisions, and we don't want to get into the language, I guess, but how much of the revisions that you envision here could potentially already be covered in the policies, the discipline policies that we did review with the firearms? Like how much, do we need to create a different one just to acknowledge law enforcement, or is what we've done already with the weapons discipline one already give us the guidance on this?
That's true, and it is cross-referenced, down at the bottom in terms of that. I think, so yes, I think it does. I guess, I guess an approach could be to just, I think if we're, I guess I'm thinking just off the top of my head here to your question, if we left, if we are going to leave in anything in relationship to like referral or forwarding evidence to law enforcement, I would want to be, provide again, the reminder of the explicitness about the firearms piece. I guess an approach could be, if we do feel like it's covered, under, both JICH already, the, drug and alcohol policy, it's already covered under weapons. It's covered under bullying. We had the cross-reference that there's already issues, in other separate policies we have law enforcement referred to. I guess an approach could be to not even include that phrasing, right?
And so, yeah, that's interesting. And this is part of as I look at this, the entirety of this work, and I don't want to say that this is an example of it, but again, raising points of concern that we could potentially be trying to revise policies that are only in place to ensure that there is the thought of including law enforcement when it really shouldn't even be part of the equation to begin with. So it almost like locks us into this thinking. But we have a policy that addresses weapons. We have a policy that addresses drugs. Why do we need a separate one that addresses how law enforcement deals with these things when we've already tried to acknowledge or tried to describe our overall relationship with law? It just seems like we're locking ourselves into thinking that these need to be revised when they're already being taken care of elsewhere.
Well, good. Bringing back the lens of, is this just the way we've always done it, and should we continue? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly something that we can look at, bringing back this policy with and without that language.
Yeah, and just again raising just points of concerns for the discussion.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good thing for us to think through.
Ms. Rosalbetter.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to clarify, Aaron, and I'm sorry, I remember us having discussion about weapons and some of the specificity about that, but I just can't recall. So I'm seeing here where the guidance is just specifically about firearms violations to law enforcement. So is that our policy? Is that I can't remember when you're talking Mr. Rodriguez brought up the weapons part from the other policy, like firearms is specifically would be a referral to law enforcement and not the other weapons?
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
As required by the Federal Gun-Free Schools Act.
Right. Okay.
And in the weapons policy, we had some definitional language around firearms.
Okay. But was there not any other instance of any other weapons? Like, was that part of that discussion? I just can't recall. Okay, so this was something that's already been decided as a district that other weapons wouldn't be a referral. I guess I'm just trying to understand.
Well, I think in this, we're saying it's not a required referral, right?
Yes. Okay.
The required referral is for the firearms because that's federally mandated.
Thank you. Okay. So the other piece is giving, again, some, whatever it's the word I'm looking for, like the ability for administrators to make a case-by-case basis for those other weapons. Okay, I was just trying to understand about the specific, but thank you for a reminder about the law piece. Okay, thank you.
Chair Victor?
Yeah, just to echo the sentiment of not including anything, of deleting that sentence and not including it here, the language here, when we have it in the other policy regarding firearms. Just for clarity and consistency, and so that people can read one policy and know what our what our rules are.
Great. Let's go ahead and move to the next one. So this is the last of the kind of individual policies we'll talk about tonight before we kind of have a more general discussion about the KLG. So KI visitors. So this is one, and again, I'll bring the language up in a minute so you can see it. But there are, no legal requirements related to referrals or inclusion of law enforcement in this policy. So this is fully within our discretion about how or if and how we would include that. Our proposal, again, this just takes us to KLG, and really Drummond's recommendation as well, I'll say, when we asked them to review, was to remove the language regarding law enforcement from this policy and add it to the KLG relations with law enforcement authorities. And our initial proposal would be potentially with the same guidelines as spelled out in this current policy. So just pulling it out of the visitor policy and locating it in kind of a newly established, law enforcement, relations with law enforcement where it should be, because that's effectively what it speaks to. So I'll share, I see, thank you, Anne, for sharing the link. KI, visitors to schools. Go. So this is under the umbrella of visits by law enforcement agencies and DHHS. They as well, just in relationship, and we'll need to kind of take this up, Drummond's recommendation was actually to remove both the references to law enforcement and the references to DHHS from this policy, and to move the language around law enforcement, as we've said, to KLG, and to move the language around DHHS to the child abuse and neglect policy, so that all of that is kind of located in one place, right, when we're considering those issues. So I don't want to distract us with that, but just want to acknowledge that that was part of their recommendation. So here again, our proposal is to move this language out of this policy and into KLG. So I think, but with some similar, potentially with similar guidelines, because we feel like this offers a level of protection for students, that we feel is appropriate in terms of the potential for law enforcement engaging with them at school, and during school hours.
So I'm starting to get, as we've moved through them, starting to get a better idea of more or less what KLG is shaping to be.
Yep.
And it's maybe we're about to get to it, so I don't want to steal anyone's thunder, but it's is it just pretty much summarizing all of the need to involve law enforcement situations, the need to, that very first question on our bullet points? Is that pretty much what KLG is coming up to be?
I think broadly speaking, it would lay out the various parameters around how and when, we would interact, share information and allow for interactions with students and with law enforcement, with students, while they're, within our care. So we have a couple bullets to kind of get to that. Again, we can kind of just advance to that. Here, kind of the recommendation. This is kind of where we came to. We went through all these individual policies and we're like, well, this, these little things here, ultimately this just gets to the need to establish kind of, a policy that kind of summarizes, provides a bit more global summary as opposed to having it located in bits and pieces, throughout our policy book. So if folks think we're ready, I think let's go ahead and move to KLG and have a little more, a bit more substantive discussion around what that policy would look like. Is that any questions last questions before we move on?
Any questions from the committee members? I think we're good to move on.
Okay. So Jake, if you could bring that up, you'll see as Jake screens through, there are two policies that we haven't had yet reviewed and we haven't discussed as a team, the one around security cameras and bomb threats. But I think, the work that we've done on kind of these prior 7, leading us to kind of need to have this conversation about KLG, means we should go ahead and move into the work around KLG, and we'll be able to identify proposed revisions for those policies. And we'll have, the Drummond review about what's required legally or not from, by the time we reconvene. So recognize that there are those 2 others that just we didn't get to, skipped over when we had our initial meeting and didn't have Drummond review. But so KLG, so here we are, kind of the most significant proposal in addition is to establish this policy that again, has not existed previously, though we had references to it in the, in the board packet or in the policy book. So, we're proposing to establish this as a new kind of umbrella policy to describe our relationship with law enforcement. As we've mentioned, these next two bullets are addressing, so two specific objectives for the policy are to address these criteria and guidelines of when it's appropriate to share information with law enforcement. So this is around kind of removing that designation, as we spoke about earlier, from JRA, where, we can share information without parental consent, and providing some criteria about when it is appropriate. So there is a legal requirement that we do have criteria and guidelines, but what those criteria and guidelines are at our discretion. So the kind of recommendation in the consultation with Drummond is that, we would locate that here within KLG in terms of what those criteria and guidelines would be. So this third bullet is just what we were speaking about of kind of pulling the language out of the visitor policy about interaction with law enforcement and putting it in this to make it more accessible, easier to find, as opposed to having it buried into in the visitor policy. That's one of the other objectives of the policy. We have a few model policies. So Drummond has a draft model policy for this, as well as a related administrative regulation. From the state of Washington, there was a research guide that they did around the role of law enforcement and SROs and so forth in the state of Washington. In its appendix, it has a number of model policies that may be relevant for our drafting in this regard. And then the Massachusetts one, as I went back to that, I'm not sure it will be as relevant, but I left it in there for consideration because I think it had been part of earlier conversations. Because that is specifically around MOU with SROs, so it may not be as relevant for our work moving forward. I'll say, we have not begun the work to draft this. We got through the policy review, that we've just kind of gone through as a group and realized the need for this. I think there's the potential as well, to provide some kind of summary and overarching statements based on, the input we got from the stakeholder engagement that we had earlier this year, and some of the discussion we've been having in terms of the lenses and, the various kind of continua that we've been weighing in terms of our relationship with law enforcement and when we feel like it would be appropriate and it would provide benefit to either our community or individuals within our community while mitigating the potential negative implications around that. So I think it has the potential to allow for some broader kind of framing language, as well as the specifics around when it's appropriate to share information in interactions at school with law enforcement and providing that specific guidance within this policy. So let me pause there, see if, again, anybody else, Superintendent or, our Dr. Ahmed or Dr. Giesman had anything to add about kind of our discussion around this. Okay, and if not, it may be useful, again, the Drummond one, is not particularly substantive. We would be adding a fair amount of language by bringing in these other pieces. So, this is the drafting and development of this policy, will be, I think will end up being more substantive, by including these elements than currently kind of the model policy that they provided, kind of demonstrates. So if there are any more comments from our group, questions, reflections, thoughts about this. So I think ideally, we're looking for, some feedback or guidance to help us initiate a draft of it so that we can kind of get into it more substantively with the group, at our next meeting. So open for kind of conversation.
Yeah. Ms. Chung?
Thank you. I'm reading the document right now, and in the second paragraph, there's a part that says the superintendent/administration shall inform law enforcement authorities when they have suspected that a student or staff member may have violated a law, state or federal law. Does that kind of conflict with JCIH? Because if a student is caught with alcohol or drugs, they'd be technically breaking like a local federal law of like drinking underage.
I'm pulling it up here. So I think that, there will be, again, their model policy sits just kind of out there, not necessarily in concert at this moment with like what our policies are. So that'll be a point of reconciliation that we'll need to address. So that's.
Which policy were you looking at, Ms. Chen?
You're muted, Emily.
I was just looking, I didn't know if there were that many, but the one KLG at near the bottom, KLG activities.
Woodson sample policy.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that one.
If I can jump in, it is, if it was revised back in 2018, it certainly, that's the date that it has at the top. So it certainly sounds like something from 2018, which is not that long ago, but because it does have a lot of the shall include law enforcement language. It is a one-way road in this proposal, so to speak. Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
And just to be clear, we bring this forward just as, they provide a lot of, model policies for us as kind of like a starting point to work from. So we're not proposing it as kind of, to adopt that policy. We have a bunch of work, I think.
That's my bad. I thought that there was only one document we were looking at.
And to Assistant Superintendent Townsend's point, if we were to work with this one, the amount of revisions we've already kind of acknowledged would have to happen are significant. But yeah, any Mr. Irish? I don't know if
Jeff, I don't know if you're speaking, but
we don't have audio for you. Yeah. Yeah, Jeff. Well, now it shows like. Okay, so he'll call. Yeah, Jeff wrote on the chat that he's gonna call the superintendent tomorrow. Anyone else? Okay. So as far as like feedback, it's been light on this one, on this end. Do you feel like you have? We talked about the Drummond Woodson one, but we've not talked about the Washington. Model.
Yeah, I don't think. The Washington document is a long. So it's many page kind of tool. So I would encourage people between now and then to kind of look at the model policies at the back. I think that's the most relevant piece. And I can send the kind of pagination numbers, right, to kind of direct you to what's most relevant. So I don't think we need to talk necessarily about it. I think I just wanted to be transparent with some of the resources we'd use to inform the drafting of the policy, because I think it does have good, there are some elements of it where it helps, provides some helpful explicit, kind of guidance around sharing of information, around the roles, things of that nature. So, I think I feel like our conversations over the past few months have given us some direction around, some introductory language that we would want to provide based on, the lenses we've been talking about, the continua, from the last meeting in terms of how we're approaching this, and the feedback from the stakeholder engagement and kind of the summary that we, talked about last meeting, that, that provides some useful, material for us to work from to articulate some level of introduction before we get into some of the specifics about the sharing of information and interactions at school that we would propose. But open to other feedback of what folks might want to see in that, right, in terms of expressions around our relationship that we would, because I think it feels like that's part of what the need is now, and the, need for clarity in the community is in moving away from our relationship with the SROs. It's a question I've heard, like was fundamentally one of the questions for our stakeholder engagement was, what should our relationship be, right? And, we're certainly articulating that in many discrete elements in various policies, but I think this policy, in addition to spelling out, some of these specific objectives, gives us an opportunity to assert kind of more clearly from the board perspective, how we envision that relationship.
I'm gonna. This is going to be a similar point of concern that what I said earlier. So, and I'm going to use an example and I hate to use comparison examples or analogies, but for some reason I'm hope that this helps. When I worked in a skilled nursing facility, and we were working with a patient, and there was a reason that, through your judgment, you had to call an ambulance. Before doing that, you check the chart, and you might have a DNR, right? A do not risk. You still call the ambulance, but the interaction is very different when you have a DNR. So it made me think, do we have a set of policies that tell us how we engage with, like, paramedics, with firefighters? Because again, we're falling into we've always done it this way, just to think that there needs to be specific language. And I know that there's circumstances that are unique, so I don't want to completely step over that. But KLG, to me, feels like it should be where we are obligated to have law enforcement included. That's where KLG to me needs to be. And that, by the way, I believe acknowledges the feedback that we've gotten from the community, because that is not the only time that law enforcement is going to be involved. All these other policies, as we said, our firearms policy gives us guidance about that. Our drug use policy gives us guidance about that. So if we keep, KLG for something other than those specific situations where we have to required by law, I believe then we start to look at the relationship with a lens that's problematic and lends itself to be interpreted in ways that in the future we're going to regret.
Can I just reflect on that for a moment? I think that if that's the direction that we want to go, then we need the policy, if nothing else, to just make it clear that those are the only instances in which the police is involved. Because, to your sort of comparison with paramedics, we don't have policies around that, because we assume that people are going to make the right decision and contact paramedics when they think that paramedics need to be contacted. But I think the history on this particular issue is that we may, as American society does, over-engage with the police. And so there's an underlying desire to to not just have it be wide open to, anybody can make the judgment call. Yes, you must call when there's, a firearm involved or a bomb involved. But, in all the other situations, just kind of use your judgment. which is not, I don't think, what you're trying to get at. And so I think if nothing else, the policy has to specify that. And then and I'm not in any way, shape, or form endorsing the DW and the Drummond-Woodson policy, but I do think that it covers those other quadrants in that four square thing that we did around, engaging the police to help with student activities and things along those lines. To help us with our safety planning, to help us with things like that, where they have specialized expertise. And, that I do think that it's worth thinking through, again, like a statement that says, the only time that you engage with the police is when there's a weapon on, or a bomb or something along those lines. Is important, but there are all of these other opportunities to actually leverage the value of the police that I don't want to sort of, it should not go at least thought through whether we actually want them involved in that or not.
I appreciate that reflection. I and I appreciate what we're adding here just to the thought process of how we're looking at this. I'll sit with that for a moment, but I really appreciate the reflection on that. Do we have any other questions or comments? What else do you need from us right now? Was that helpful, what we've gone through?
Yeah, for sure. Yep.
Super helpful.
Yep.
Are we on time? 7:20. Are we going to 7:30?
Or 7:25, maybe.
So if we don't have, and it's really, I feel bad that Mr. Irish is that his audio didn't work there at the end. I look forward to hearing with his thoughts as well. So hopefully we can capture that at some point. So if we don't have any other questions or anything else on this, we'll what's the plan then for next meeting? What do you expect to have back for us, and where we are in the steps and timeline? The proposal would be we would bring forward draft language for KLG, so building up, a reiteration. Anyway, revising this, we'll figure out how much of the Drummond model policy language we use or whatever, but bringing forward draft language for KLG and the proposed revisions to the other policies that we talked through. So, and I think we'd start with KLG next time. Feels like the place to begin, and then we can address those other ones. And I think I'll flag that I think from there, obviously that's June. We're talking about our June meeting. Our June meeting is currently scheduled for June 22nd. That I think that leads us to a place of trying to do, a decision at that point will be, certainly there's some internal engagement with the policy draft and revisions that we'll want to do, with our, sharing at that point draft language, draft revisions with our school leaders, as well as with PEA. I think it would be appropriate at that time, so then we should have a conversation at that point about what additional engagement. I think certainly sharing back with the stakeholder group we convened at a minimum, right? I'm curious about student, some level of more direct student feedback that we might be able to accomplish. So I think we should talk about that in terms of landing the final timeline, of when these would be, we collect that feedback, propose final revisions, right, for the committee to adopt and then move forward to the board. But it feels like we are getting to a place to have substantive proposed revisions that I think in a manner that's benefited us in our work thus far with the other, discipline policies and the harassment policy, that would potentially be the appropriate moment to get some additional feedback. And some of that I think could happen over the summer, right, to position us to resume, kind of be able to move forward when we reconvene in August.
we can talk about that. So for June, we'd bring forward draft language to kind of get that settled here a little bit of what we would want to get feedback on from these other stakeholders.
Ms. Rosa Bader?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to clarify, Aaron, about the timing, because the goal was to have this the policy in place for the school year to start, right? Mm-hmm. So as far as, so if the next meeting, I was just trying to figure out when student engagement could happen, because then it's summertime, right? So.
Yeah, I think it challenges that timeline some, you know, and I know summer can be a challenging one, but I think, you know, the work to get the draft revisions together, you know, I think our challenge is we don't yet have something to get their feedback on per se. And so, you know, but that'll be a decision point for us about, you know, just weighing those two things, whether there's the value in doing that engagement, pushing out the final adoption timeline a little bit, right? And
okay, thank you, because I feel strongly about getting the student feedback, but I don't know what the you know, argument for having it done right at the beginning of the school year. So I guess that will be to be continued to discuss. But thanks for the clarification on that.
Ms. Chung?
And it's a little bit early to say this, but after we get the draft, I'm sure that I could get some feedback over the summer, because I do have direct connection with some different student organizations at both of the, or at some of the high schools.
Yeah, I think it'd be great to work with you and the other student board members to be able to, and anyway, yeah, that'd be great. Thank you for that offer, Ms. Chung.
Great. Okay, so that sounds like a good plan for next meeting, and you know, starting then to think about the re-engagement process. Yeah, great. I've got some ideas too. This is really again another great meeting, another good discussion about this work. I really appreciate the openness that we're bringing to it. Yeah, I think we're heading in the right direction. I appreciate everyone's engagement tonight. If we don't have any other questions or comments, I'll entertain a motion to. Oh, this is going to be tricky without Jeff. A motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Oh man, he's quick with it. He used the hand. All right, moved by Ms. Better, second by Mr. Irish. All those in favor indicate. Bam, there you go. That's unanimous with Ms. Chung voting with the committee members. All right, thank you everyone. Have a great night.
Okay.